All right, so as I said, psychologists and sociologists have their way of, talking about this phenomenon. The primacy principle argues that the values that we learn earliest in life are the ones that form the core of our value systems when we become adults. And for most of us, these values remain with us throughout our entire lives. The primacy principle says the values that we learn earliest in life. And there is a lot of research to support the suggestion that it is really the first few years of life that are most critical here. Like maybe, from birth to age 5. Maybe the first 5 years of a person's life that's really the most critical. This idea of the primacy principle says that those values that we learn very early on form the core of our value systems that shape the way that we think about the world around us when we become adults. The structuring principle, the corollary, it's not either the primacy principle or the structuring principle. It's both of them. They work in tandem. They're complementary ideas, corollaries. Okay? The structuring principle means that the values that we learn earliest in life help us structure or assimilate new and sometimes competing information into our existing value systems. And again, the evidence seems to suggest that this early learning is so powerful that many of us, even we're confronted with data, information that would objectively contradict what we already believe, we seem to find a way to make it fit. That's the power of the structuring principle, right? We have this ability as human beings somehow to take things, new information, even if it's contradictory, and make it fit into what we already believe. It is interesting that we do, as human beings, seem to have a selective perception of reality, right? How many of you have ever had the experience of, maybe watching a news story? Does anybody watch television news anymore? Or is it all, you get it all off the internet now? But still, there are like, video reports and stuff, right? You watch it, whatever your news source is, right? You see this video report of some event or some episode. I tell you what, since we just went through an election cycle, let's say you're watching a candidate debate, right? You and your friend are watching a debate, or it doesn't even, two people are watching a debate. How is it that they seem to be able to come away, they both watch the same thing, right? They get the same information, but they come away with two completely different interpretations of what was said and what was meant, okay? And what the implications are, right? That should tell us, just the fact that we've all had that kind of experience should tell us that there's some degree of selective perception going on. Political scientists who study voting behavior, and particularly who write about the impact of debates, like in presidential campaigns, are constantly telling us that presidential debates really don't change it. There's no real evidence that they change anybody's mind, right? The main effect is that they reinforce what people already believe. Right? And that is, kind of a way of thinking about the power of the selective perception, and this, which is connected to the structuring principle idea. We just find a way to make it fit with what we already believe. Okay? So what these two principles suggest is that childhood, and as I said, maybe even the first 5 years of a person's life, is really the most critical phase of teaching and learning values, a process that we're going to refer to here as we go along as political socialization. We're not quite to the point of defining that yet, but we'll get to there very quickly, okay? So before we move on to that, though, let me ask you, the segments that we watch from that film, it's pretty obvious to us from our American perspective and from the benefit of almost 100 years, later, to see what was going on. Very obvious what the communists in Russia were up to, very obvious what the Nazis were up to. In authoritarian systems, the use of propaganda is real conspicuous, okay? But what I'm really trying to get you to consider is it any less, is it utilized any less in democratic systems than it is in authoritarian systems? Do you understand what I'm asking you here? We can watch these segments. We can see what the communists in Russia were up to. We can see what the Nazis in Germany were up to. Is there anything comparable? Is there anything similar in democratic systems? In the United States, for example, that you can point to that would suggest an effort on the part of the regime to build loyalty and support for the regime?
Pledge of allegiance.
I heard one online and one person in the classroom said in tandem the Pledge of Allegiance. Think about that for a moment, right? We're going to stand kindergartners up, first graders, second graders, all the way up through, I assume they still do that all the way through, 12th grade, right? We're going to stand kids up and have them put their hand over their heart. Think about the symbolism of that for a moment, right? Put their hand over their heart and recite the following: I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And by the way, do we believe for a second that kindergartners, first graders, second graders, I don't know, maybe even up through 12th grade, do they intellectually understand the words that they're reciting? Do we even want them to intellectually understand the words that they're reciting? Or do we just want them to repeat it day after day, year after year, so that by the time they become young adults, this has become sort of an ingrained part of their belief system? Is it any wonder that when we see someone desecrate the flag, for example, we get emotionally wrought up, right? Because we've just spent 12 years of our life swearing our undying loyalty and allegiance to this emblem. If someone's going to desecrate it, it's going to evoke an emotional reaction. Now, I want to be real clear here. No one heard me say that it's a bad idea to have children say the Pledge of Allegiance. I don't believe it's a bad idea. I think it's a good idea to have children say the Pledge of Allegiance. In fact, if I had my way, they'd say it twice a day, the morning and the afternoon, right? But I do think we ought to recognize it for what it is. It is an effort to build loyalty and support for the regime. Nothing wrong with that. It's always much easier to recognize these kind of things when we can see them playing out in some other society. It's often more difficult to recognize these things when they're playing out in our own society. For one thing, it's generally values that we already hold. So when those values are being taught or when those values are being reinforced, it doesn't really occur to us that someone is, propagating values. It's only when the values are different that we really notice it, right? Anything else? I mean, the Pledge of Allegiance is a pretty good one, right? Anything else you can point to? We don't have to get a whole long list. All I'm really trying to emphasize to you is that while it may not be as ham-handed in democratic systems, as obvious in democratic systems as it is in authoritarian systems, I think there is still, at least we can concede that there's some effort that's undertaken in democratic systems as well to propagate values in support of the regime. The only difference is that the values of our regime, the values of the American political system are different than the values of communist Russia, are different than the values of Nazi Germany. Okay? I want to suggest to you that given this primacy principle, the structuring principle, that let me take this off for just a second so you don't get too busy writing, okay? Here's what I want you to think about as we go through the rest of today's class meeting and probably into Thursday's class meeting, okay, as we talk about these ideas. Value systems, whether they're communist or Nazi or liberal American values or anything else, are not biological traits. Okay? They're not biologically transmitted. There's no gene for democracy or capitalism or racism or whatever, right? I don't know, what was it, about 20 years ago or so? Maybe late 1990s, when geneticists announced that they had mapped the human genome. It's been about 20 years now, I guess. I remember I was kind of interested in that when that was going on back in the late 90s, 98, 99, somewhere around in there. Been long enough ago now that I've forgotten exactly. It seems like it was about that time, but I was reading as much in the newspapers as I could or whatever other sources I could get my hands on. I'm certainly not, I don't have the scientific genetics background, but I was reading enough popular sources, you know, that I could make some sense out of some things. But of all the things that I read, I never remember reading anything, you know, where they were saying, okay, they've identified the gene for this, or they've identified the gene for that, they've identified, you know, whatever. I never read an article where they reported that they had found the gene for democracy or for any other value system, right? So my point to you is that all value systems are the result of teaching and learning. If they're not biologically transmitted, they're the result of teaching and learning. The only real question is, how does that teaching and learning take place? Okay? So let me suggest a couple of things here for us to think about, okay? Take a step back and lay out a couple of assertions for you. First of all, you can see right up there at the top, it says that diffuse support is critical to the long-term maintenance and stability of a political system. That term, diffuse support, the word diffuse means spread out, okay? So what, you know, political scientists sometimes will distinguish between diffuse support and specific support. Let me start with specific support because I think it's a little bit more obvious. So specific support is the kind of support that people express when they say that they voted for Donald Trump, right? They support Trump, they support his agenda, they support his policies, or they do not support Trump. They didn't vote for Trump, they don't support Trump agenda, or Biden, or whoever the candidate is, or the public official is, and whatever level it is that we're talking about. If a person says, I support Republican candidates, that's an expression of specific support. Or that I support the Republican Party's agenda, or the Democratic candidates, or the Democratic Party's agenda, right? You understand what I'm saying? Or support, specific support can be expressed for a particular policy, right? Alternative. I support, you know, an increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Those are all examples of what political scientists refer to as specific support, okay? Diffuse support, broad, spread out support means support for the political system itself or one of its parts. So it's the kind of support that people express when they say that they're proud, patriotic Americans, that they love their country. And it may not be perfect, but it's the best. And if you don't like it, leave. Those kinds of things that people express. And it's the kind of support that is essential regardless of whether one is a Democrat or Republican or a liberal or conservative or a moderate or a supporter of Joe Biden or a supporter of Donald Trump, right? None of those groups of people that I just mentioned to you can claim that they love their country more than the other group, right? Democrats and Republicans are both proud, patriotic Americans and love their country. Liberals and conservatives alike are proud, patriotic Americans and love their country. So diffuse support is the kind of support that people express for the system itself, right? It often takes the form of patriotism, but it doesn't necessarily have to be so conspicuously patriotism. It's the kind of support that people express for the institution of the presidency, for example, or the courts, or the concept of rule of law, right? Or various other aspects of our political system. Okay, does that distinction between diffuse support and specific support make sense? Okay, so what we're interested in is diffuse support for now. Okay, we can set specific support aside, and we're saying that diffuse support is critical to the long-term maintenance and stability of the political system. Political science, sometimes that term itself makes some of my colleagues in biology or chemistry or other natural sciences sort of chuckle. I've had that conversation numerous times over my long career with people in biology or chemistry. They'll laugh and say, political science, there's no such thing. Well, I don't want to get into that discussion, except to say that it's a science in that the study of politics is, the modern study of politics is a science in that it attempts to conform to the scientific method. We develop theories and hypotheses from those theories, and then we test those hypotheses against real world data and determine, usually through statistical analysis of the data, whether or not the hypothesis is supported by the data. That's generally what we mean by the scientific method, right? It's a little bit more challenging in some ways to apply the scientific method to the study of human behavior. And that's really what we're doing in the study of politics. We're studying a particular kind of political behavior, or a particular kind of human behavior called politics. And in some ways, because it's not a laboratory science and we can't physically manipulate variables, at least not without raising serious ethical questions, right? It's a little bit more challenging sometimes, right? And maybe that's why some of my colleagues in the natural sciences scoff that what we're actually doing is science, because maybe it's not, because we're not a laboratory science and we can't physically manipulate variables. Anyway, I don't want to digress too much on that point. Here's what I'm really trying to get to, okay? If we had this room full of political science, let's say we had a larger room, a lecture hall, and there were 1,000 political scientists. We're at the convention, the annual convention of the American Political Science Association. It's not a COVID year, right? So that we can all go to conventions and stuff. Just like medical doctors have the AMA and lawyers have the ABA, right? Their professional association, right? Political scientists have this organization called the American Political Science Association. And just like they have medical conventions and, lawyer conventions and so on, political scientists have their conventions as well. So we're in this big lecture hall. We've got 1,000 political scientists in the room. If we were to ask them, how many of you agree with that statement up there, right? Diffuse support is critical to the long-term maintenance and stability of the political system. My guess is we would get probably 99% of political scientists who would affirm that assertion. The point I'm trying to make is that political science it's not a laboratory science, to be sure, for the most part, but it's also an immature science. And we can see that it's only really been around in applying the scientific method for about a half a century, since the middle part of the 20th century. Before that, it was more like the study of philosophy or the study of, maybe history or something like that. But beginning in the middle part of the 20th century, we had sort of this intellectual shift in political science. So because it's an immature discipline, we really haven't developed any scientific laws. Yeah, you know what a scientific law is, right? Like in physics, laws of motion, right? Or even in some social sciences, say economics. How many of you have taken an economics course? You've learned about the law of demand, the law of supply, The law of diminishing marginal returns. What do scientists mean when they talk about a scientific law? If you break it, you go to jail? No. What do they mean by a scientific law?
Proven by scientific method.
Okay, certainly not incorrect. Can we say anything more precise? What? That's pretty good. Okay, that's a pretty good way to think about it. Like, you know, I've said maybe in this class before, but I've certainly in other classes many, many times, I don't have to stand up here and do this all day long, right? For you to convince you that Newton was onto something when he developed that law of gravity, right? The point is that there's so many repeated experiments. This has been tested out so many times with repeated experiments that the scientific community just accepts it as the truth, right? Okay, so what I'm trying to confess to you about my discipline, political science, is that it's probably because it's just such a young discipline, we haven't developed any of those laws about human political behavior yet, at least not that I'm aware of. I think I would be aware of it, right? We don't have something like the law of supply, the law of demand like they have in economics. But this is about as close as we can get, at least in terms of agreement among scholars about the truth or the veracity of an assertion, okay? As I said, I bet 99% of our political scientists in our convention would agree with that assertion, that a political system, if it's going to survive for any indefinite period of time, has to have this type of support, this diffuse support. Can't exist without it. Okay, and then the second point there says, not only does it have to have it, but it has to have some mechanism to generate it, to create it. You see, it doesn't just exist in nature, where the political system can go out and mine it out of the side of a mountain or something, right? There has to be some process in place for the political system to engender that support or develop that support. Well, that raises a very obvious question. How do political systems do that? Well, we just saw in watching those segments from the film, one way that political systems have done that historically, and that is through a deliberate, orchestrated propaganda campaign. How do you build support for the regime? Well, you keep hammering away on the values that you want people to believe, particularly when they're young, and that way when they grow up, they just hold those values, you know, as sacred. That's the third item there. But there are other things that we can point to, and one very obvious way to build support is by consistently satisfying the demands and expectations of the population. That one seems pretty obvious, doesn't it, right? If people believe in the political society that they live in, that their expectations are being met and their demands are being satisfied, that probably is going to result in support being built for the system. People are basically happy, then they're more likely to support the regime. The second one, though, may not be as conspicuously obvious, at least at first glance: coercion or force. But let me tell you this. This is a tried and true method that regimes have used for millennia. You know, there's something pretty compelling about the point of a gun at someone's head, or soldiers on street corners, or tanks rolling down the city streets, that engender support for the regime. Now, as you might guess, this is a tactic or an approach that's used more by authoritarian regimes than by democratic regimes, but I don't think we can say that it's non-existent in democratic regimes. Okay? All right, so obviously we're out of time. We're going to pick up where we're really going to pick up and run. Next time, notice I've got the red arrow there by the socialization process. We didn't even get to that, but that's what we really want to be developing. I'm going to tell you, of the four that are listed there, That's the key to our understanding of this process. Okay, so that's where we'll begin on Thursday.